Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight I continue my incredibly dull history series, and tonight you'll be learning about the history of clothes, or fashion, if you will. I'll give you a hint as to where it started. We needed to stay warm, but it got a lot more complicated from there. These dull history stories are intended to help you go to sleep with a smile on your face, and I really hope it does just that for you. Did you know that nearly half of the people who listen to my channel regularly aren't subscribed? If you're one of those people, I would be most grateful if you would take a second just to hit the subscribe button. It's free. Thank you. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. And as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever you lie upon tonight. Really feel that support. And beneath all of that, there is the support of the earth, our home, our constant support. And notice that the more you become aware of that support, the more you can let go. The more you can sink into this moment. 9. You are safe. Know that tonight my voice is nothing but a friend, a guide of kindness that will only ever take you to safe places. Allow my voice to be an anchor of peace, guiding you to beautiful, wondrous places. 8. Become aware of your body now. And as you do, just become aware of your breath for a moment. Perhaps take a deep breath in through your nose when you're ready. And breathe out when you're ready. And maybe another deep breath. In. And out. And as you become aware of that breath, the breathing out, with each out breath, let go a little more. Maybe move through your body. Check where you're holding tension or pain. Maybe it's in your feet, your lower legs, your thighs, your belly, your chest, your back, or shoulders, your hands, your arms, your neck, or maybe you're like me. Do you hold the tension in your face? Just let it all go now. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts you may be having, don't fight them. Just see them for what they are. Thoughts. A symptom of being human. And as they arrive, welcome them. And then just let them go. Watch them float away like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. Six. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. You deserve peace. There is nowhere to be now. Nowhere to go. No obligations. Absolutely nothing to do but settle into this moment. Five. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It's just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. Maybe you can find it tonight. Maybe you can journey to that peace with your mind's eye now. Maybe you find it in your chest, or in your head. Wherever you might find it, know that it's a constant friend. For perhaps feel a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things, for the shelter you have tonight, whatever it may be. For the use of your body, for the ability to just lie here and listen to a sleep story. For those you love and who love you, know that you are loved, whoever you are and wherever you are tonight. Three. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to see our ancient ancestors sitting around campfires, hoping for something nice to wear. They had to start somewhere, and I'll tell you all about it in a minute. 2. Check in with your body one more time now. Releasing anywhere that you're still holding on. And 1. Completely letting go now. As I tell you tonight's sleep story. Part 1, in which the first clothes are argued over at length. No one really remembers the first person who decided to wear clothes. This is probably because that person was far too busy trying to stop the clothes from falling off to make any kind of lasting impression. Early clothing wasn't particularly glamorous. It was more a question of, will this large piece of animal skin stay on if I tie it here? Followed by the disappointing realization that, no, it would not. The earliest garments were less about fashion and more about not freezing to death. The exact moment when wrapping something around the body became a trend was likely never recorded, mostly because no one at the time had invented pockets to carry anything to write with. They also hadn't invented paper or pens or writing. What they did have, however, were sticks and a healthy instinct to avoid discomfort. There was much debate about how exactly to secure these early garments. Some favored tying knots, which were reliable but tricky to undo during urgent visits to the bushes. Others preferred simply holding the garment in place with their hands, which was practical until they needed their hands for anything else. And then there were the visionaries, those who tried to use tree sap as a kind of glue. These people spent a great deal of time stuck to things. Social conventions around clothing were still in their infancy. It's widely believed that many people simply wore whatever they happened to find lying on the ground. This occasionally led to awkward situations when two people reached for the same animal skin at the same time. Some historians speculate that this may have been the earliest form of what would eventually become the wardrobe argument. It's important to note that these early clothes didn't come in sizes. One size did not so much fit all as sort of hung around most. Fashion trends were slow to catch on, largely because no one could agree on whether the shoulder or the waist was the more appropriate anchoring point. This would become an ongoing discussion, lasting several millennia. Part 2, in which animal hides become a statement piece. It didn't take long for people to realize that animal hides were more than just a way to stop the wind getting in where it wasn't wanted. They could also be, well, slightly nicer to look at than being cold and covered in mud. The earliest fashion shows, if they could be called that, probably involved two people accidentally wearing the same type of hide and one of them making a face about it. The selection process for a good hide was a serious matter. Some preferred the thick, slightly stiff hides of larger animals, which provided excellent insulation but made it nearly impossible to sit down without sounding like someone was stepping on a bag of old leaves. Others favored larger skins, which allowed for greater mobility, but were noticeably less effective against a cold breeze. Many people compromised by wearing whatever hadn't already been dragged off by wolves. Maintenance was another key issue. Freshly removed hides were famously uncooperative. Then some clever person eventually discovered that if you left them to dry out a bit, they became marginally less offensive. Of course, by then, they were also as stiff as a board. Walking in them was a bit like strapping a damp tent to your body and hoping for the best. Decoration was a luxury few could afford. A particularly enthusiastic individual might scratch a few lines into their hide or tie on a feather they'd found, but this was considered risky. A stray spark from the fire could send the entire outfit up in flames, and no one wanted to be remembered as the person who invented the look and then burned down half the camp. Yet, despite all this, a quiet sort of pride emerged. Someone would wrap their hide a little more snugly, or secure it with a slightly better knot, and another person might nod in approval, or at least not laugh quite as loudly. This marked the dawn of something very powerful indeed. The idea that clothes could say something about a person, even if what they mostly said at that point was, "I killed something and it fits." Part 3, in which tanning becomes everyone's least favorite job. As time went on, it became clear that simply draping animal hides over oneself wasn't the most pleasant long-term arrangement. People began experimenting with ways to make them more wearable, less sticky, and ideally less likely to give you a rash. This was the accidental birth of tanning, or as it was known back then, whatever it takes to make this horrible thing less horrible. The early methods weren't particularly refined. One approach involved leaving the hide out in the sun for a very long time, occasionally poking it with a stick to see if anything had improved. Another involved rubbing various mysterious substances into it: mud, ash, crushed berries, or anything someone swore had worked last time. A few unlucky souls discovered that burying the hides near the toilet pit was particularly effective, though no one wanted to discuss why. This new trade of hide preparation quickly became the least glamorous position in the community. Tanners were easy to identify, not by what they wore, but by their aroma. While others enjoyed lively evenings around the fire, tanners spent their nights, well, I'll leave it to your imagination. As for stitching the hides together, that required ingenuity and an unreasonable level of patience. Needles were made from bone, and the first people to sew two hides together were celebrated briefly as visionaries, until everyone realized the result was basically just a heavier, less flexible hide that still smelled like the back of a mammoth. And yet, something remarkable was happening. Little by little, garments became less about survival and more about shape. People started experimenting with sleeves, though no one quite agreed on how many a person should have. One particularly bold individual tried 3, causing much discussion and eventually laughter that echoed through the camp for weeks. Part 4, in which opinions begin to form, slowly and loudly. It was inevitable, really. Once everyone had a functioning hide that no longer dripped, smelled like a bog, or stuck to the wrong parts of their body, the human urge to develop opinions arrived. It didn't arrive all at once, of course. Opinions crept in slowly, like a draft through a badly tied knot. Someone would remark, offhandedly, that perhaps their neighbor's hide was a bit uneven. Another would suggest that a certain shoulder cut looked unusual. And just like that, fashion criticism was born. The earliest fashion disputes were wonderfully unproductive. There were no magazines, no mirrors, and no reliable way to know what you actually looked like. But that didn't stop anyone from loudly declaring that their way of wearing a hide was clearly the best way. Meetings began to occur, mostly unintentionally. A small group would gather around the fire, pretending to talk about hunting or tool repair, but really keeping one eye on what everyone else was wearing. Subtle gestures, a raised eyebrow here, a squint there, spoke volumes. Entire social hierarchies started to take shape based on whose hide didn't bunch up at the knees when they sat down. Of course, there were rebels. There are always rebels. One person might deliberately wear the rough side out to show they didn't care what anyone thought. Another might refuse to secure their hide at all, choosing instead to hold it up with both hands as a statement. This was very impractical, but deeply dramatic, and the rest of the group couldn't quite decide whether to laugh or applaud. Eventually, certain looks began to stick, mostly by accident. If someone important wore their hide a certain way and managed not to trip over it for a few days, others would copy them. Part 5, in which clothes begin to tell people where you're from. Once humans got the hang of cutting holes in the right places and tying things where they made the least trouble, clothing started to do more than keep people warm. It began to say things. Not actual words, of course. No one was embroidering declarations yet. But it quietly announced where you belonged. If your hide was cut a certain way, others could guess which group you were from, or at least which group you had stolen it from. As tribes settled in different regions, the available materials changed. Some had more animals, some had plants that could be stripped and twisted into something resembling thread, and others had nothing but a lot of opinions and some bark. Naturally, this led to distinct local styles. Coastal groups often wore lighter materials because of the heat, while people further inland layered up like walking huts. It was, in its own way, the first version of a regional fashion week, except no one was invited, and everyone smelled faintly of smoke and damp hair. Decoration followed quickly. A bit of shell here, a tooth there, a feather if you were feeling bold. At first, decoration was about using what was lying around, but soon people realized decoration could mean something. A few shells might show you'd survived a long journey. A bit of fur might suggest you'd caught something that didn't want to be caught. Even a smudge of ochre could say, I have time to make myself look marginally less like everyone else. Trade only accelerated the trend. When groups met at rivers, crossroads, or slightly suspicious open fields, clothing became a quiet but powerful part of negotiations. A stranger in an unfamiliar type of tunic was intriguing, possibly dangerous, but certainly intriguing. People swapped not just goods, but also styles, sometimes picking up a new belt arrangement the way others might pick up a cold. Over time, the shape of clothing slowly shifted from whatever keeps me alive to whatever makes me look slightly better than my neighbor. And just like that, the idea of fashion as a form of communication began to spread, centuries before anyone thought to write down a single rule about it. Part 6, in which weaving takes much longer than anyone expected. The move from animal hides to actual textiles was neither quick nor particularly well planned. Someone, somewhere, looked at a pile of plant fibers and thought, I could make something out of this. What followed was several days of confusion, tangled string, and people swearing at knots that hadn't even existed a moment before. But slowly, thread by thread, weaving began. The first woven fabrics were about as soft as a doormat and roughly the same shape. They weren't fitted, they didn't drape elegantly, they simply existed. Heavy, lumpy rectangles tied around the body in ways that suggested people were making it up as they went along. Which, of course, they were. If early tailoring was a headache, weaving was a long, dull sermon. Weaving frames, the ancestors of looms, started out as crooked sticks propped up against rocks. Entire afternoons were lost to untangling threads, arguing over which direction was up, and asking whose turn it was to fetch water. These early weavers became experts in patience, or at least in pretending to have it. Finishing one piece of cloth was cause for mild applause and a shared sigh of relief. But the results were undeniable. Cloth could be cut, folded, layered, and even colored with crushed plants and minerals, though the colors mostly came out as various shades of mud. Still, compared to stiff hides, woven cloth was flexible. It moved when you moved, which felt almost luxurious after centuries of creaking around like a poorly assembled tent. Communities with good weavers quickly found themselves envied. People began trading, not just meat and tools, but lengths of fabric. A single well-woven sheet could earn a bundle of food, a shiny object, or, if you were very persuasive, someone's best goat. Fabric had value now, not just as clothing, but as currency, status, and a reason to hold long, unnecessarily serious meetings about pattern consistency. Part 7, in which clothes finally start to look like clothes. Once people figured out that weaving produced something softer than a dead animal, they naturally wanted to improve it. The first step was spinning fibers into something less lumpy. This required a calm temperament, nimble fingers, and an ability to sit still for hours without throwing the whole thing into the fire. A spinning stick, a bit of patience, and suddenly thread could be made finer, longer, and far less likely to fall apart at awkward moments. With finer thread came smoother fabric, and with smoother fabric came the entirely predictable urge to make it look nicer. Dyeing began in a very casual way. Someone dropped a cloth into some crushed berries, noticed it came out purple-ish, and decided this was thrilling. Others tried flowers, mud, ash, even old cooking pots. Some dyes looked glorious for a day, and then faded to a color best described as sad brown. Still, the thrill of color had arrived. What followed was a steady, unstoppable drift toward what we might recognize as clothing. Tunics appeared, simple rectangles with a head hole and 2 armholes. No one called it a tunic yet, of course. They just called it the thing that doesn't fall off when you walk. Belts were still essential, mostly to stop everything from riding up or sliding down. But at least people now looked a little less like they'd wrapped themselves in a sack. Dye colors also began to take on meaning. A particular shade might suggest your group, your rank, or simply that you had access to better berries. People noticed. Compliments became sharper. "Oh, you've gone with green again," someone might say, with a tone that didn't sound entirely like admiration. And just like that, clothing became tangled with status. As techniques spread, clothing grew varied. Some villages favored plain, sturdy cloth, practical and easy to repair. Others developed a taste for flair, brighter dyes, fringed edges, bits of decoration that caught the light. No one would admit to caring too much, but they cared a great deal. Part 8, in which layers become a display of great importance. At some point in history, someone with a bit more food than everyone else decided that one layer of clothing simply wasn't enough. 2 layers, they thought, would look more impressive. Then someone else, not to be outdone, added a 3rd. Before long, The wealthy were rustling around under the weight of several tunics, belts, shawls, and a look of smug satisfaction. Practicality took a quiet step back and never really recovered. These extra layers served no real purpose except to say, I don't have to do anything today, while ordinary folk wore something light enough to chop wood or carry water in. The upper echelons wore elaborate garments that required several other people to help them get dressed. It was less about comfort and more about theater. Every extra bit of fabric was like announcing your status at a volume that could be heard from down the road. The dyes, too, grew bolder. Some colors were hard to make, certain purples, deep reds, bright blues, and this scarcity gave them prestige. If you wore one of those shades, you were either important or pretending to be. Common people stuck to the colors of the earth, browns, creams, and greens that wouldn't draw too much attention, or at least wouldn't show dirt too quickly. Nobles, meanwhile, paraded around looking like overturned fruit baskets. Accessories multiplied at alarming speed. Belts became decorative. Scarves became dramatic. Cloaks dragged along the ground behind their owners, picking up an impressive amount of dust and admiration in equal measure. The fancier the person, the less likely it was that they could bend over without assistance. This, it turned out, was the point. Servants and lower classes were required to dress plainly, which suited nobody but the rich. The rules around who could wear what grew more rigid. In some places, it was literally illegal to wear certain colors or fabrics unless you were of a certain rank. People followed these rules reluctantly, occasionally getting around them with a bit of dye trickery or very small patterns that didn't technically count. Part 9, in which clothes become unnecessarily complicated. The medieval and Renaissance eras saw clothing take a sharp turn from a few sensible layers to structural engineering. What had once been a simple tunic was now accompanied by laces, buttons, fastenings, boning, padding, embroidery, stiff collars, and the general sense that getting dressed in the morning required a small team of very patient people. No one really understood how it had escalated so quickly. It just had. Buttons appeared and changed everything. At first they were purely practical, holding bits of fabric together in a sensible way. but very quickly, people began adding them where they served no purpose at all. A jacket might have 30 buttons, but only 2 that actually worked. The rest were decorative, or more accurately, a way to signal that you had so much time and money that you could afford to sew shiny objects to your clothes just for fun. Lace also made its debut. It was delicate, fragile, expensive, and almost entirely impractical. People loved it. Ruffs, those famously oversized neck frills, began as a modest trim and ballooned into stiff circular frames so wide they made turning your head a logistical problem. Nobles walked around looking like their heads were emerging from the center of a decorative dinner plate, and everyone pretended this was elegant. The fabrics themselves grew richer. Silk, velvet, and brocade became the materials of choice for those at the top. They were heavy, luxurious, and entirely unsuitable for doing anything useful. The poor, meanwhile, still wore wool, linen, or rough cloth, and spent their lives trying not to get mud on their one decent tunic. The divide between fashion and function had never been clearer. Tailors, once humble hide cutters, now wielded real influence. They were responsible for creating garments so structured they could probably stand up on their own. Fittings became lengthy affairs. Nobles fussed over sleeve lengths and embroidery patterns, while the tailors nodded solemnly and tried not to scream internally. Part 10, in which clothing begins to compete with architecture. By the 17th and 18th centuries, clothing had moved well beyond the realm of common sense. What people wore wasn't just clothing anymore. It was structure. It was spectacle. It was a walking, button-covered declaration that you were very important and absolutely incapable of getting dressed alone. Wigs grew to truly unreasonable proportions. What began as a tidy way to cover thinning hair turned into towering constructions of hair, powder, ribbons, flowers, and occasionally bits of fruit. Entire afternoons were dedicated to styling them. Some were so large they required reinforcement with wire frames, making it impossible to get through low doorways without tilting your head at an angle that suggested long-term neck pain. Corsets became tighter and more elaborate. They pulled waists in to improbable sizes forcing people to stand very straight and breathe in short, shallow bursts. This was considered attractive. People fainted at parties, not because the conversation was thrilling, but because their ribs couldn't fully expand. Meanwhile, the lower classes, who still needed to breathe while doing things like work, or simpler stays, or none at all. The dresses and coats of the wealthy expanded outward in every direction. Hooped skirts grew so wide that people had to turn sideways to pass through doors. Men strutted about in frock coats with tails that could double as picnic blankets. Everything was embroidered, beaded, or lined with some expensive material that made a satisfying swishing sound as they walked. Fashion was now less about what you liked and more about what society expected. Nobles wore what their rank demanded, which often meant dressing like an elaborate cake stand. Servants helped them balance, lace, button, and adjust their outfits into place. Standing still was encouraged. Sitting down was complicated. Of course, not everyone could afford such excess. Most people still wore clothes made of wool or linen, cut simply and worn hard. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just in food or land. It was stitched right into the fabric on their backs. Part 11, in which fashion comes crashing back down to earth. Eventually, all great extravagances meet their limit, and in fashion, that limit usually arrives when too many people can't get through a door at the same time. As revolutions and political upheavals rolled through Europe in the late 18th century, society had less patience for wigs tall enough to interfere with low-hanging chandeliers. Grand gowns and heavily embroidered coats began to give way to simpler, more practical shapes, though not without some resistance from those who had invested heavily in lace. The French Revolution made it quite clear that walking around dressed like a cake wasn't a good idea when the streets were full of people who couldn't afford sugar. Nobility began dressing down, or at least pretending to. Colors softened, lines straightened, and wigs quietly disappeared from the highest of heads. Simplicity became fashionable, which was fortunate for everyone involved, particularly carpenters who no longer had to widen doors. Meanwhile, industry began to stir. The textile trade, which had once depended entirely on human hands and endless patience found itself powered by machines. Weaving and spinning grew faster. Fabrics became cheaper. And suddenly clothing wasn't just for the rich. Ordinary people could afford more than one outfit. This changed everything. The well-off still found ways to signal their status. They always do. But clothing became noticeably less theatrical. The 19th century brought coats with structure, but not too much of it. Dresses that were still wide, but no longer required architectural blueprints, and boots that were made for actual walking. Men's fashion in particular became almost aggressively practical. Trousers, shirts, waistcoats, and jackets in serious, sensible colors. No ribbons, no towering wigs, just a growing obsession with proper tailoring. For women, the story was slower. The corset stuck around like an unwanted guest who refused to take the hint. Skirts flared, cinched, and layered in endless variations. But even these shifted gradually toward mobility, at least more in the hoop skirt era. Clothing began at last to bend toward comfort, or something that could almost be mistaken for it. Part 12, in which the Victorians attempt to be sensible and largely fail. The Victorian age arrived with grand ambitions of restraint and respectability. People began wearing darker colors, straighter lines, and more practical cuts. Or at least that was the theory. In practice, fashion simply swapped one form of discomfort for another. Hoop skirts disappeared, yes, but they were replaced by bustles, large padded structures strapped to the back of a dress that made it look as though the wearer had accidentally sat on a cushion and decided to keep it there permanently. Corsets remained firmly in place. They weren't quite as punishing as those of earlier centuries, but they still demanded a posture better suited to posing for portraits than for bending down to pick up a dropped coin. Tight lacing became a quiet competition among some women, as though lung capacity were a personal failing. Breathing deeply was considered undignified anyway. Men's fashion by now had become almost unrecognizably serious. Gone were the bright colors and flamboyant coats. In their place, black suits, crisp collars, and an expression that said, "I own a pocket watch and have strong feelings about punctuality." The well-dressed Victorian man was essentially a walking rectangle in wool. If a man arrived at a gathering wearing anything too lively, people assumed something had gone wrong at the tailor's. Children were dressed like miniature adults, often against their will. Stiff collars, tight boots, and complicated buttons ensured no one could run too far or too fast. It was all very proper. Even the working classes, who had no patience for lace and padding, found themselves hemmed in by conventions. Clothes were more affordable, thanks to industrialization, but the social rules about how one ought to dress were stricter than ever. Despite all this restraint, Victorians couldn't resist a bit of unnecessary drama. Layers were still popular, hats were mandatory in polite company, and gloves were worn at almost every opportunity. Clothing had moved past towering wigs and silk hoops, but it had not yet discovered the joy of letting people move freely. Part 13, in which clothes begin to make a bit of sense, but only a bit. The turn of the 20th century brought with it a quiet rebellion against centuries of being trussed up like furniture. Sports, work, and a series of very disruptive wars pushed clothing towards something more practical. The corset finally began to lose its iron grip, partly because people discovered they could, in fact, breathe without it, and partly because the world had bigger problems than waist measurements. Women's clothing loosened. Skirts shortened just enough to allow for walking at something above a shuffle. Waistlines relaxed, fabrics softened, and for the first time in centuries, some women could dress themselves without the assistance of a household staff. The invention of the bra didn't exactly liberate everyone overnight, but it did suggest that rib crushing might not be a permanent requirement. Men's clothing became even simpler. The suit took its modern shape, plain, structured, and endlessly replicated. A man in 1910 could walk into a room in 1950 and not look entirely out of place, which says a lot about how stubborn men's fashion can be. Hats were still considered essential, but the towering wigs and peacock bright coats were long gone. Practicality had finally found a seat at the table. War uniforms also played their part. Soldiers needed clothes that allowed them to move, survive, and not collapse under 40 layers of lace. After the wars, these designs influenced everyday fashion. Shorter coats, cleaner cuts, sturdier fabrics. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Comfort was no longer a scandalous idea. And then came the 1920s. For a brief, glorious moment, fashion let its hair down. Hems rose higher, suits relaxed, and people danced in clothing that didn't creak or require special furniture to support it. It wasn't equality, not by a long shot, but it was movement, both figurative and literal, in a freer direction. Part 14, in which clothes escape the rulebook. The mid-20th century changed everything. Factories were humming, fabrics were cheaper, and clothing was no longer the private playground of the wealthy. For the first time in history, ordinary people had options, actual options, about what to wear. It was a bit chaotic at first. Some leaned toward neat suits and sensible skirts. Others threw that idea out the window entirely and wore whatever made them feel like themselves. Parents were appalled. Teenagers were delighted. Youth culture arrived like a loud, uninvited guest at a quiet dinner party. Denim, once a humble work fabric, became a symbol of rebellion. T-shirts, previously considered underwear, were suddenly worn out in the open. Leather jackets, floral dresses, flared trousers. None of it required permission from a tailor, a social class, or a monarch with strong opinions about lace. Clothes were no longer just clothes. They were declarations. Mass production meant styles spread fast. What someone wore in London could turn up a week later in New York, Paris, or a small town that had only just figured out what jazz was. Department stores and mail-order catalogs turned fashion into something you could order without even leaving your house. A luxury that once required titles, servants, and at least 3 people to help lace a corset. There was still plenty of posturing, of course. Every new wave of fashion horrified the previous one. Mini-skirts shocked. Long hair on men caused debates. Patterned shirts and loud prints offended more traditional sensibilities. But unlike previous centuries, no one could really stop it anymore. There were simply too many people wearing too many different things. Practicality stayed, but it no longer had the final say. The world had entered an age where fashion was part personal expression, part peer pressure, and part general confusion, and it suited people just fine. Part 15, in which fashion goes global and everyone has an opinion. By the late 20th century, clothing had become something much bigger than fabric. It was identity, rebellion, branding, nostalgia, and increasingly, business on a massive scale. Designers who once sketched quietly in studios suddenly had their names splashed across t-shirts, shoes, and handbags. A jacket was no longer just a jacket. It was a statement about which designer you either could or couldn't afford. Globalization meant trends moved at dizzying speed. What started on a runway in Paris could be copied in a factory on the other side of the world and hanging in a shop a few weeks later. Fashion became fast. People who once owned a handful of outfits now filled wardrobes with seasonal rotations, impulse buys, and a growing pile of clothes they didn't quite remember purchasing. Subcultures made their mark. Punks ripped their clothes on purpose, a gesture that would have horrified the early tanners. Hippies layered loose, colorful fabrics. Goths wrapped themselves in black. Hip-hop culture elevated sportswear to statement wear. Grunge made it fashionable to look like you hadn't tried at all. For the first time, clothing wasn't just divided by class or geography. It was divided by taste, mood, and tribe. The arrival of the internet only sped things up. Trends spread in hours rather than years. Fashion blogs, then social media, then influencers. All of it created a never-ending loop of new styles being born, copied, argued over, and forgotten again. What once took centuries to evolve now took months, sometimes days. People who tried to keep up were exhausted. People who didn't felt superior about it. But beneath all the noise, the purpose of clothing remained the same as it had been at the very beginning. Something to wrap around yourself, to feel warm, safe, and, now more than ever, seen. Part 16, in which we end up exactly where we began. After thousands of years, countless stitches, and a truly unnecessary number of buttons, clothing has come full circle. We've gone from animal hides tied with bits of sinew to smart fabrics, brand names, and entire industries built around deciding what shade of beige is in this year. And yet, at its heart, the purpose hasn't changed all that much. People still reach for something to cover themselves, to keep out the cold, and to feel like they belong somewhere. Modern fashion can be loud, fast, and complicated, but it's also deeply personal. Some people still dress to signal status, just as nobles once swanned about in expensive dyes. Others wear the same jumper for 10 years, because it feels familiar. A hoodie can mean comfort, rebellion, laziness, or all three at once. And unlike the early tribes, no one needs to argue over the best way to tie a hide, though people do still argue about what counts as good taste. The world has never been more connected, and neither has fashion. A pattern that once belonged to one village can now be worn anywhere in the world. Fabrics travel faster than caravans ever could. What was once a matter of survival is now a language. We dress not just for the weather, but to say something about who we are, even if that something is simply, "I can't be bothered today." Some people still sew their own clothes. Others let entire industries do it for them. Some follow every trend with precision. Others stubbornly wear the same jeans until they surrender at the knees. It's all part of the same long, meandering story, one that's far less glamorous than most people think, and far more human. In the end, clothes have always been a bit ridiculous. They've been stiff, itchy, too tight, too heavy, too wide, too short, too fashionable, or not fashionable enough. But they've also been a constant companion, wrapping around each new chapter of human history like a badly fitted but familiar coat.